The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, so we will now start with our first panel of the day. Panel 1 will be titled Understanding Military Roles in Human Security in War-Torn Areas. And for this, I would like to invite our moderator for today, Dr. Sarah Jane Meharg from the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security, to present our speakers for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Babin. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our esteemed panelists for this, our first panel of the day. Human security is experiencing a top-down moment. The strategic advancement of a human security framework in NATO compels militaries to follow suit at the national level. And for the Canadian Armed Forces and other allied militaries, human security is already part and parcel of expeditionary and DOMOps, but relies upon ground truths in a bottom-up approach to operation, rather than a more formalized top-down framework or doctrine. And it becomes important to challenge our thinking and broaden our perspectives by describing why a human security framework complements and reinforces traditional state security and enables militaries to integrate a number of aspects of mission mandates and military tasks into a more comprehensive understanding of requirements, and in what Dr. Martel mentioned this morning, all in a poly-crisis environment. So I'm really quite thrilled to introduce our panelists that we have with us today. We have, to my right, Lieutenant Colonel retired David Lambert.
Good morning, everyone.
We have, at the end, Lieutenant Colonel retired Rachel Grimes. And in the middle, Clare Hutchinson. So our esteemed panelists were also selected today because they are all recent contributors of chapters to the Dallaire Center of Excellence for Peace and Security's new book, Evolving Human Security. The panelists have a practitioner's approach amongst many other things, and they bridge really the operational and strategic spaces of human security. And in fact, they will help us navigate from what has come before for militaries undertaking such roles and responsibilities, and what they now need to lean towards when it comes to securing humans. So this panel is an opportunity to discuss strategic level human security and the operational imperative of securing humans related to military roles, and inside this conference's theme about the so-called unchanging nature of war. And this is where I'm hoping the discussion will perhaps disrupt the theory and expand our understanding of the realities of human security in war-torn areas. So here's our order of go. We're going to begin with Clare. Clare is going to set the stage for us. We are then going to turn to Rachel for her opening remarks, and then we will end with David for his opening remarks, and David has a deck that he will be presenting. Each of our panelists will be speaking for about 5 minutes, and then we will undertake a moderated discussion. I have some prepared questions, and then that will happen for about 30 minutes. Then we will turn to our audience for a deep and meaningful Q&A, and then I will lastly turn back to our panelists for their final remarks to leave us with some food for thought. So, Clare, I invite you to take the stage.
Thank you very much. If you can hear me. Thank you. Hello, everybody, gentlewomen and gentlemen. It's nice to see you. I want to thank Sarah and the Dallaire Center for inviting me to participate and contribute to what must be the best book in the history of the universe. So I'm going to talk to you today from my experiences. I established the NATO Human Security Unit headquarters in 2019, but also as my experiences, I was in peacekeeping for 15 years on the ground in many missions as well as headquarters. And to see how not only has the face of conflict and war changed over the last 25 years since I've been working in this field, but also how our responses and understanding of war has affected many of the ways our civilians live. And, you know, we see now even changing in the face of war peacekeeping, of which Canadian military will be affected, the downsizing now of multi-dimensional missions where peacekeeping in a way doesn't hardly exist anymore. We've seen the change of NATO and NATO's response since the withdrawal from Afghanistan and with Ukraine. So there is a change. There's a change to war, to the conception of how we intervene, but also on how war is undertaken. And part of this, a lot of this, is about the focus of civilians as targets, and therefore lies human security and the underlying concept of human security as a human, both a human direction and a human response. And so this is really the premise, well, what I think is the premise of human security. But there lies the problem, because nobody actually knows what it is. Nobody knows what it is, nobody can agree on what it is, and therefore nobody knows how to respond. And we have a huge problem with this. If you're a European, you are really, really in a pickle, because you have 3 different organizations that say 3 different things about human security, and you, as a military operator, are supposed to respond to that. NATO defines human security, as you'll know, with 5 cross-cutting topics. I will hold my hand up because I was the one that put them under human security, so it's my fault, because I think it's actually dated. I don't think that's the right concept for human security today. The UN describes it under a developmental track, which I think isn't really useful for the military itself, because it doesn't give us is it 12 different areas or 7 different areas? It doesn't give us a huge scope in terms of focusing where we need to be. And so this is the problem with human security. And this is the problem human security is failing. Again, this is how I see it. I think we need, while we did have a stronger move pre-Ukraine, and I say this from NATO's perspective, there was a move because with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we saw that we needed new tools. There was a different way. We need to take the lessons from Afghanistan where the hearts and minds were playing into how do we respond to the human voice of what is conflict. Ukraine has shifted that somewhat, and we've gone back to kinetic engagement. We've gone back to the idea of traditional warfare, where I worry that human security is going to be left out, and we say this in our most amazing book in the universe. So I think there are a few points which we'll go further into, but I'm going to give you a few points up front. What do we do? What do we need to do to get human security on track? First of all, we need the definition that's collective, that at least is an understanding. We need to move it away from the Sustainable Development Goals. This is not what we're about. We're about linking it to security. We're about linking it to national security. We're about doing the protection of civilians, but in a way that's much broader. We need to define what security is, because, and it's been mentioned a few times, security is not the same for everybody. Security, I too lived, I'm in Nova Scotia. I was in the hurricane. I've been in the storms. I've been in everything that we have. We have all of them, lucky us. And my security as a woman and as a person in a maritime province is not going to be the same as a man who lives in Ottawa. We don't do that well enough. We do not do that exhaustive understanding of security. So when we talk about human security, who are we talking about? Because it might not be about what my security is, or what we see in Côte d'Ivoire, or what different people see in different parts of the world. And that we haven't done enough of. We need to get the language that's agreed between strategic and operational. And I know I'm preaching to the converted when I say this, but the political level is not talking the same language as the operational level. And there is a huge problem. Developing policy in NATO at headquarters, I know when you go through a military committee, we aren't saying the same thing. And if we can't get that defined and operationalized, there is no point in putting money into human security, because it's just simply a document that sits there. And then we need to adapt it, adapt to military operational necessity. We need to prepare the military. We need to get understanding about that. And we need to be in line with our allies and partners but we don't have to follow our allies and partners, because I think Canada has the ability to lead. We led by defining in 1999, we led on protection of civilians and on children on conflict, and I think it's time we lead on human security, because we have the ability, and we have the necessity, and we have the capability. And I think it's time we did so. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Rachel.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And I'd also like to publicly acknowledge the editing skills by Sarah and Shannon for this amazing book. And if you don't have it, I hope you'll go and get a copy of it. I don't know if anyone has ever written a chapter for a book before, but I looked at it this morning, and a year later after I'd written it, I said to myself, did I really say these things? What did I mean? Because I brought in a new term called women, peace and human security in cosmopolitan militaries, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but I think I must have been drinking the Kool-Aid when I wrote that chapter. My chapter focuses on the challenges of a military in implementing policies which are linked to non-traditional aspects of security, things which are quite new to the military in a way. And I think that if you're not a cosmopolitan military, or if you're just, as I imagine and I say in my chapter, that the Canadian Armed Forces is just starting to be a cosmopolitan military, it is difficult to wonder how women, peace and human security relates to a soldier on the ground. So I tried to look at how we can get these policies across the J functions. Now, if anyone doesn't know what a J function is, go and talk to somebody in uniform and they will give you a great lesson in what a J staff function is. I think that the military rightly has to focus on neutralising threats such as insurgents and perhaps even one day a peer-on-peer adversary. But I argue that in a 21st century military, they can do both. You can consider the enemy, and you can also consider the predicament of the civilians around you. By 2050, the UN has told us that 70% of the population are going to live in urban areas. And if we look at Ukraine today, we can see that wars are won or lost in an urban environment. So the military doesn't have the luxury to overlook what's happening to the civilian picture. It has to be fully aware of the civilian picture so that it can carry on with its task. And I'm just going to give you an example of how in Ukraine at the moment, depending on how old you are or what sex you are, can in fact impact on how you experience conflict. So if you're a man or a male youth in Ukraine, and you get caught by Russian military, the chances are you'll just be assassinated, summarily executed on the spot. If you're a young child, you'll probably be human trafficked into Belarus or into Russia. If you're a woman or a girl, you'll be kept in a school or a church hall, and you'll be raped every day by the military that are in your town. If you think that as a military planner, knowing those different aspects of what's happening to a human isn't important to how you plan your operation, then I don't think that we're ready for the conflicts that we might have to be involved in future conflicts. It's all part of enhancing our situational awareness. Some people say it's enhancing our operational effectiveness. I suggest it's just being part of the military and understanding the human terrain around us. So despite this military necessity, and Claire's talked about this a little bit, there are some challenges in getting these policies which relate to protection of civilians, children in armed conflict, human trafficking, into a military mentality. And I'm not saying this in any position of grandeur. I was in the military for 30 years, and I know that it's tough we've been focused to think about an enemy-centric approach to operations, and it is difficult to start to think more broadly. But, and Claire did touch on this, I think that the policies that are coming out of the headquarters are almost written as a representative of the nations that are pushing these subjects, by the individuals that push these subjects, and they're not thinking about the end user, which is the soldier that's on the ground. I'm sorry I'm being so land-centric, forgive me to all the maritime and air colleagues, but ultimately going back to future conflicts are going to be contested in urban environments for a long time to come. So we're not really thinking about the person that's going to be implementing that policy. And that leads to a lack of understanding at the operational and tactical level. But even more frustrating, there is a confusion between all these different policies. What does one mean? If you work on conflict-related sexual violence, are you allowed to work on protection of civilians? And it reminds me, and I'm showing my age here, of the Game of Thrones. Because the Starks, the Lannisters, Jon Snow, the woman with the dragons, in the early seasons, they spent their entire time arguing with each other. But really, they should have combined efforts and thought about what we're going to do about the White Walkers and the Night King. And they weren't. And I feel that at the moment, we are in that area, and we've got to sort of, we don't need to go to season 8 because it was awful, but we need to get to season 7 where we're working together. It doesn't matter what we call it, we just need to get on and do it. And also, I'll just talk very briefly about the language in these policies. I once made the big mistake of standing in front of a parachute regiment and saying, "Hello, I'm your gender advisor," to which one of the corporals put his hand up and said, "Can you tell me what sex I am, ma'am?" We have to be more savvy in getting these policies over to people who really don't care about UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So at some point, we've got to work out what does it mean to an intelligence planner, an operations planner. I'm just going to give you one more example before I finish. In 2015, I was attached to the Peshmerga, and we were aware that in Mosul, there was a prison that was holding up to 1,000 women and girls from ethnic groups who were, again, being raped on a regular basis. And so the Iraqi troops and the Peshmerga troops, who initially thought that they would be going into this battle together, they had to decide what was going to happen. What were they going to do? There were many choices for Daesh, for Islamic State. They could kill these women, or they would flood the area with thousands of women who were in trauma. And so the Iraqis and the Peshmerga had to plan beforehand, what are we going to do so that we can keep our momentum up and not get flooded by these civilians. And so they had to go out and work with the UN and with other agencies. And I think that's a good example of a cosmopolitan military, where you've got the civilian threat assessment as part of your key part of your planning. So looking back at that original chapter in the book, I'd be less pompous, I'd be less pretentious, I wouldn't talk about women, peace and human security. The women in Mosul, the women in Ukraine don't care what it is that we're doing. We just need to have militaries who have institutionally been trained to consider non-traditional security threats, such as human trafficking, children in armed conflict, and conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. You know, this is where we start getting very serious. These are very serious topics. And I just want to thank Claire and Rachel for your comments before we turn to David. This is what I meant by I'm hoping that our discussion actually disrupts some theory. This is a dirty, awful world that we're asking people to function in and to recover from. And we need to figure this out in a way that has us have a cosmopolitan approach to comprehensive work that we do. David.
Right, thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody, and it's thanks to those who made it possible for me to be here today. The privilege. Right, I'll look at this from the angle I've been asked to look at it from, oddly enough, and that's very much a pragmatic means by which the military can operationalize an approach to human security. So it's difficult to say to the military, oh, go out and do human security and make things better, without actually telling the military what it is, i.e. formally defining it, and giving martial forces a decent framework through which they can visualize it and actually operationalize it. So that's the current situation with human security there, with a lot of what people call cross-cutting topics, but there's no formal definition for human security. There's no formal definition as to what people mean by cross-cutting topics. And all these things sometimes run against each other. They certainly conflict with each other or become confused with one another. And sometimes they compete with one another, depending upon who's sitting in the room. So in order to understand it and see how the military can operationalize human security and certainly contribute to it, we need to define it, say where it comes from and why it's important, and then provide a framework in which commanders can visualize it and their role, and then actually apply their capabilities within human security. With anything to talk about the military, we have to remember the first principle, and that's the unique role of military forces. And the most important word in that sentence there is, of course, the second one. And actually, I think that's the shortest PowerPoint slide I've ever written. So so in trying to define what human security is, we can probably start with the UN model. There's no sense fighting the DS pinks on that, or what's broadly accepted, and quite a good model. So, you know, I proposed a simple, straightforward definition that talks about the state, because that's what security is. It's a state for individuals and groups, free from immediate threats, ease of access to basic needs, and assured the rule of law and equal treatment. I draw your attention to the last phrase in that sentence. That's through acceptable governance systems, because certain aspects of human security are culturally dependent upon the environment in which you find yourself. So where does it come from? Well, it stems from, like, just war theory, the Occidental Judeo-Christian tradition and belief that all human life is of great and equal importance. Why is it important? Why, you know, what benefits does a human security focus and approach give to coalitions and campaigning military forces? First of all, it builds greater perceptions of legitimacy, what Army doctrine would call campaign authority in an environment of competition and conflict. It builds your key narratives to strategic communication, and in the long run, it's absolutely fundamental for enduring peace and security and stability. But despite those understandings, it's not actually, there's no clear model or key definition that exists in NATO doctrine or most of that of our allies. NATO Command, Allied Command Operations, NATO ACO, has produced quite a good handbook on the protection of civilians, which one would argue is part of human security. But it wasn't formally edited, it wasn't formally published, it did not go through the NATO Standardization Office, so it was not seen by the nations, not ratified by the nations, and not incorporated into the national doctrines of allied countries. Chatting with Colin McGee last night, you reminded me that human security is addressed a little bit in one of the NATO's counterinsurgency doctrines. And it does actually put into a sorting hat some of the aspects of human security, but it doesn't really go far enough, and it's buried the concept within counterinsurgency tactical level doctrine. It's not even at the operational publication where one would expect to find it. NATO capstone doctrine, the writing team was put in a room and said, right, NATO has signed up to all these UN prescriptions of human security, WPS, and all these, throw that into doctrine. Well, no one in the room really understood or had the time or the remit to actually sort all that out. So they just took all the concepts, threw them into an annex with a little blurb beside each, and that was it. That's all they could do at the time. But it clearly states that NATO has no defined definition of human security. But we can fix that if we create a simple framework based around the UN model. So if we look at the UN model as three facets of human security, we see that most of the things that are related to human security, what people call cross-cutting topics, are actually elements or facets of human security. They focus mainly on the freedom from fear aspect of the UN model. Notice that all those terms are quantifiable as tactical tasks for the military. They're based on transitive verbs: prevent, counter, protect. The one exception to those cross-cutting themes, or what's usually grouped under there around that, is women, peace, and security. So there are three facets of WPS. One very much falls under that freedom from fear in terms of protecting women, and really a larger audience, from sexual exploitation and harm. But the other aspects of gender of WPS are more of a principle. We can take that concept and raise it up to the level of principle, the second highest level in sort of doctrinal constructs, and say this is the principle or lens through which we apply our operations and our operations dealing with human security. Right? Right. Yes. Now, how do we operationalize that? First of all, we take our model and we put it in the operating environment which we find ourselves, in the cultural context in which we exist. Remember that, as we learned in Afghanistan, women were not necessarily threatened by sexual exploitation within the society, but other people were, certainly young men and boys, as was highlighted in the Toronto Star and CBC, much to the embarrassment of the Canadian military in some ways. Everything you see there in red font is actually the military operationalization at the strategic, operational, tactical levels of human security. So in the middle, you see human security model, and taking that human security approach, that philosophical approach to our operations. Within that, strategic authorities can articulate strategic objectives, both stated and implied, for operations. And that's supported by the comprehensive approach. Again, well articulated in doctrine at NATO and in particular Canadian Army. At the operational level, where we write an operations design that leads to a campaign plan, we can articulate specific operational objectives and decisive conditions related to human security, dependent upon the strategic direction military authorities have been given, and depending upon the operating environment itself and its nature. The main effort there would be focused towards freedom of fear, given the innate capabilities of the military. Then and you could even in your operations design create a line of operation focused on human security, again, depending upon the situation. At the tactical level, where we have these cross-cutting topics, we already have a huge body of doctrine that can realize those. We call it stability, operations, and tasks. That's well articulated in doctrine. In fact, the origins of that body of doctrine, it's nothing new. Nothing's new, really. But the origins of that, the articulation of that, came out of problems that we ran into in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan with visualizing and operationalizing the full range of tactical activities that militaries are responsible for, often touching upon human security. And those doctrine, the capabilities can actually affect, if required, those other aspects of human security as defined by the UN, as you see from the dotted lines. Really, so that's the model the military needs to visualize and operationalize human security. Really, a lot of the supporting concepts, we aren't that far off, are already existing in Army doctrine, sadly not Canadian Forces Joint doctrine. But it's not that much work to put it all together and to allow commanders to visualize and operationalize it. I think that's Bob's your uncle. We're done. Okay.
Bob's your uncle.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, David. Appreciate also the visuals here. It helps us understand this framework you're offering. You know, the book, and as my three panelists know, the book really talks about the why of human security. Most of the people in uniform that I meet are wanting to know the how of human security, and that's where David has done some incredible work to really drill down into how this works for the practitioner, how this works in a day-to-day operational basis. So I really appreciate your comments, David. So let's now, all three of you have talked about a definition. So that's where we're going to start. I also, after I ask the question, I want you to know that this is a discussion, and I would love for you to offer hot pursuits on one another's remarks or comments. So do not wait for me to call upon you. If you would like to take your microphone and feedback to one another, that's what we're asking for. So to begin, let's clarify this idea of a definition of human security. So we know that there's no agreed upon term. But is it really possible to define it? We tend to define insecurity better than we do human security. We can tend to frame the opposite. But really, what purpose would clarifying the meaning of human security serve military actors in that operating environment? Would it actually serve a purpose, or can we continue without an agreed upon term? Who would like to begin?
I can.
Thanks, Claire. Go ahead.
And I'm also going to pick up on some things in disagreement with David on this. But the military need the clarity, I think, in definition, in terms, and the political level needs it not to be clear, because then you can get to manipulate it any which way you want. That is the bottom line. The reason there is no definition in NATO is because nations can't agree. They can't agree on what is included in human security. Cultural property protection, trafficking, what are the main elements that fit? And that is the reason there is no definition. But it doesn't mean it should stop or has stopped the work on this. And absolutely it shouldn't. And I don't think it should for the military, nor should it for the political. I just think it's expedient to not necessarily have a definition. There is a definition of protection of civilians, which was the Standardization Office in NATO declared in 2020 or 21. So that is clear. What is clear is we know what we do on protection of civilians. But where I disagree about the UN model And I said in my opening comments about we shouldn't be linking it to the UN model, because I think the freedom from fear, want, and dignity are vacuous. I think they do not mean anything. Whose fear, whose what want, and who gets to decide want, and what is your dignity? And I think, yes, we all have this, certain values that we set on. But I think if you link that to them, then we're going to fail in human security, because, again, it's going to be kind of this ethereal thing about what is fear? What is fear to different people? Human security needs to be very pragmatically put in terms of an operational implementation structure. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And having, again, like I said, having policies is wonderful, and I've developed policies and they were really good. They just didn't work because nobody else understood what they were. So I think the idea that we have to separate it, have it our own interpretation, or an interpretation that the military can follow, and that we need to separate women, peace, and security. Absolutely. Women, peace, and security is a very different model, and it's a different model because it's a Security Council model. Human security is a General Assembly model, so it's not even a security model. It's not about peace and security. And this is sometimes what we forget, and this is why women, peace, and security has had a lot more traction on the ground in terms of security and peace, both in the UN and for NATO and the EU, where human security, I think, is staggering a little bit, because it isn't linked right now. It's linked to development. And that, to me, is the huge problem we have.
There's a lot there to unpack, Claire. I'm not so obsessed about having a definition. I think that the policies that NATO have mandated, which have been pushed out by the nations, 80% of what those policies are asking are included with international humanitarian law. So we don't need a definition to tell us that we should make sure that we conduct collateral damage estimates before we blow something up. Maybe we need to think a little bit more about if we're blowing up a subterranean pipe that we're not aware of. But ultimately, I find this debate about having a definition, and I live it every day because I'm in Allied Command Transformation at NATO, and I work with my partners in Mons and at the headquarters. I sort of feel that asking for a definition is just, it's like putting a roadblock in, it's like slowing you down. We've got the policies, the countries have agreed to it. Maybe we've not done a very good job at translating it into military activity. We've got a norm in international humanitarian law which tells us that we should be doing it. The only area, I think, where NATO has made it more challenging for itself is in the policy that's on protection of civilians. It's got a line that says, protect civilians from your own actions, so that goes back to collateral damage, etc. And then it says, and protect them from the harm of others. And the issue is, in IHL, which is really good at telling a military person what they can and cannot do to a civilian, IHL doesn't really tell you, as somebody in combat, that you should go and intervene if somebody is possibly being human trafficked into another country, or if somebody comes to you and says, I've just been raped. Incidentally, that is very rare that a military personnel would have to deal with that, because if people are raped, men or women, they don't really want to go and see somebody in uniform to talk about it. But for sure, there are moments in military operations where the military are the only people in the area. Even in Afghanistan, after a while, we didn't see MSF, and they are like the special forces of NGOs and IOs. And so you knew when MSF left, but actually it was just Regional Command South or Helmand that were working in that area. And so we do have in the military, we've got military police who are used to dealing with domestic violence and unfortunately looking at rape internally. And also we've got medics who can respond to people who've been survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So for all the talk of a definition, I would argue that actually what we need to be better at is getting those policies. If we're writing any policies in future, let's think about that end user. And then ACO and ACT, we maybe need to give the military committee a little bit more advice on what these policies look like on the ground, because otherwise we're just we're chasing our tails. And there is one area, the Comprehensive Approach Action Plan, that doesn't have a definition, and that tells you that you're meant to go and talk to the NGOs and IOs around you, or to go and learn from Google or whoever it is. It talks about the military instrument of power working with other instruments of power. There's no definition on that, and we do it. So I'm not so hard over on a definition.
Thanks, Rachel. David?
Funny I am. It's sort of thing I get paid for, funny enough. I think it is fundamentally important. I don't know if that's actually been tried through the NATO Terminology Forum, which is quite good at developing terminology, to get a consensus on what's meant by human security. I think its link to development is only there as a means to achieve a situation of human security. And I think the broad UN model on which the draft definition I proposed is based is quite good and broadly accepted. It must be if it's in the UN. We don't necessarily have to get 100% agreement on it. We can still put it in NATO as something on which to base our doctrines and our policies, which are two distinct things. I think without a definition, we keep going around in circles. The other ideal thing about a definition is it shows where the military is limited in its capabilities. You can say human security is this broad thing. Well, the military can do this in certain situations. It can help with this and this in other situations. It allows the military to articulate its limitations in terms of intellect and capability in realizing human security in a situation. You mentioned comprehensive approach is defined. It's certainly defined in the Canadian military, and the doctrine around it in NATO is certainly extensive enough that you can hang your hat on a clear definition of it. So I think a definition is fundamental as the basis for understanding what human security is and what it is not. That's it. Otherwise, we end up talking in circles.
I agree with both of them. And I think that, and maybe definition is, so NATO term, I mean, it's very hard to define something in NATO because of the committees and the agreements and all of that. But I think having just a basic understanding, because NATO has been doing the work with the policies, really good work, and now recently a policy on children armed conflict. Yeah. So I think it is possible to do this work, but there also does need to be an understanding. If it's not definition, then at least a clarity of knowledge around what should be done. Because NATO loves definitions, that is where the sort of, concentration with definitions comes. But I mean, getting a definition, like I said, the POC definition was agreed in 2021, and it was put in for discussion in 2018. So you've got a long term of so I don't think we need to be focused on it, but I do think we need it.
So we have CAF members that will say, human security, we already do this. So we don't necessarily have a formalized approach in Canada, but perhaps a formalized approach is not contingent, again, upon having a definition of human security. May or may not be, David, depending on how that works itself out. But let's now get into really this formalization of the process. If we already do this, do we actually need a formalized approach in Canada? And, why human security and why now for the CAF? Rachel?
I don't think for the CAF it's why now. I'm sure you're all aware of Lloyd Axminster. He was a diplomat. Axworthy, sorry, I'm thinking of a carpet. Very good quality carpet. Axworthy, sorry. So he introduced the term, I think, on behalf of Canada in 1996. And honestly, the Canadians, I mean, there was a bit of competition with the Japanese, but you definitely were leading on the pillar of physical protection, of freedom from fear, and the Japanese were looking at freedom from want. And I am convinced that if it hadn't been for 9/11, the rest of NATO would have soon started to follow what the Canadians were doing. And I think that you were doing it in Bosnia with the humanitarian support. And really it just came to a stop with the nomenclature of counterinsurgency, and it's all about coin. And I am super surprised that in NATO headquarters, human security is now coming to this top-down moment, because all of the policies on women, peace and security were written during a counterinsurgency era where it's easy, I think, for a military mind to think about what we do to the other. But now we're in a context of thinking about a peer-on-peer conflict. And it's quite an outrageous comment, but I have heard people say that if it comes to peer-on-peer, IHL, human security, it's all out the window because we're just focused on annihilating the enemy. So it is amazing that actually the policies, and I think Claire's got a bit of, we can thank her because she was there at the time and brought these policies to the fore. But Canada has been doing this for a long time. I would say that the only area is it's not yet institutionalized. You are relying on the personalities involved, and you've had some really good personalities that have been pushing different women, peace and security, protection of civilians, children in armed conflict, obviously. It's just how do you get it into the SOP for the soldier or the person that's going to be out on the ground? Because I don't think it's there just yet.
Maybe we could expand then the question to include, with this return to great power competition, and we have this prevention-protection dilemma that we are confronted with. It's either the protection of civilians or it's the prevention of conflict, and you have to pick sides. There's not really a space between. Good, so David's saying no. So let's expand the question to include that, but also include, why human security for the CAF as well. If you can speak to that, David. Great.
It's as I said, a lot of the tactical level things, stability operations tasks, came out of the early days of Iraq, Afghanistan, when things started to go pear-shaped and we were missing something fundamental. And it's summarized in Canadian doctrine by a little sort of anecdote from one of our allied officers was on the advance towards Baghdad. And he looked over and said, oh, look, the locals are looting the museum. I wonder who's supposed to stop that. Not me, I'm after Saddam. At least he understood the strategic intent there, but we missed something fundamental that's linked to the aspect of human security, in this case, protection of cultural property. There's always these moral imperatives, and if we actually have that, and ethical imperatives, if we actually have that indoctrinated, then it creates the mindset that's required for a lot of these things. And when we developed counterinsurgency doctrine, that's exactly what we focused on, was changing the mindset. It wasn't about new capabilities or new forces. It was about changing that mindset. When our counterinsurgency doctrine gives another vignette or anecdote about when our troops first deployed to Haiti in 2004, the situation was worse than it is now. There were no police whatsoever, and there was no one on the streets. And the force got on the ground, and the first thing they saw from the gate guard was an incident of domestic violence. A gang was out there because they're the only ones on the street, and he started slapping his girlfriend around. They sent out the QRF, detained the individual, and frog marched him down to the local police station. Now, there was no one there at the police station, but we made the point, and the family came to the gate, and the troop said, or the commander said, right, he was taken away because that is not a hallmark of stable and secure society. And they said, oh yeah, okay. And the next day, the park across the road was filled with people. Now, it's just this mindset. There was nothing in the rules of engagements necessarily. There was nothing in written orders. It was just this mindset that in order to build legitimacy, in order to create that enduring stability, regardless of the actual nature of the campaign in which you find yourself on the spectrum of conflict, there's always going to be this need to focus on aspects of human security. Part of that comes from understanding your operational environment, but also understanding the stated implied strategic intents.
Yeah, and when I'm describing the protection versus prevention dilemma, we often talk about state-centric security and people-centric security, and then there's often camps. you're in one or the other, but never the twain shall meet. So, Claire, do you want to speak to that and pick up on some of the threads that are going on across the table?
Yeah.
Thanks, Claire.
To talk and to say about, first of all, human security is not new. And as Rachel talked about, in the 90s, I mean, the idea that Lloyd Axworthy and the Norwegians who set up, I think it's the Friends of Human Security, coming on the back of Rwanda and Bosnia and the Balkans and saying that humans being affected, conflict-related sexual violence and of men and women, as well as trafficking and children being recruited as soldiers. As Canadians, as a very proud Canadian, I'm happy that we in the Security Council under the leadership of Ambassador David Angel, tabled the protection of civilians, first ever protection of civilians resolution, as well as the children on conflict resolution. We have always been leaders in moving this. And so I think we've been doing this work. We just don't call it human security. We just call it something different. And now we're in this place where there's this confusion around, the work we've done on Vancouver principles. Incredible work. I think there's two problems. One, that we, as good Canadians, don't talk enough about how good we are and how well we have put things forward and how good our forces are. I have been deployed to every peacekeeping mission, and every peacekeeping mission tells me how much they trust or they like or they respect Canadian soldiers. That is generically across the board. And there's something in that we should reflect on. And that is because I think we do human security well. I think we do the work with commitment of passion of our values. But I don't think we're doing enough of it. And I think the idea of this protection versus prevention is a huge. One of the problems is, how are we defining today armed conflict? What do we go into? How do we then do protection? How are we supposed to be involved in prevention when it's not a military activity or task? We have to redefine armed conflict, emergency, crisis, and what does that now look like? Because it's different. Peacekeeping is different. NATO is now different. The world is different. And so I think we're getting a bit trapped with that, again, lack of definition of how we deploy and what we deploy to. But I do think that we have done this work. We will continue to do this work. But we need to figure out what work we are going to do and what are we going to do well. Is it protection? Or are we going to get involved with things like early warning, which nobody's doing? The good early warning activities that our troops can see when there's risk on the ground. With NATO, when I was with NATO, I managed to get one early warning sign into the global sort of compendium. But that's not enough. And we can do better in prevention if we become also leaders on that, which I would like to see.
Thank you. Rachel, do you have any last comments?
Only that I think that Ukraine is a really good example of looking at how civilians are deliberately being targeted. They're not a byproduct. When the mayor is killed, it's deliberate. So these civilians are being focused on. And I think that our militaries have not yet got into the mindset that this is a Russian approach to war. It's not something that just happens. They are thinking about it. Peacekeeping, I know I don't really want to talk so much about peacekeeping because of this NATO fixation at the moment on peer-on-peer adversaries, but in UN missions, often we're not really thinking about what is being done to the civilians. We are just thinking about the armed groups. But I think that Ukraine is showing that this is a part of a formal approach to how warfare is going to change. It has happened in the past, but it's not been done in such an institutionalized way. ACT works a lot on cognitive warfare, and we're saying that if we've got cognitive superiority, we can outthink our adversaries. But we're missing a point that the kinetic impact of killing civilians is having a cognitive effect, both on the civilians that we are meant to be protecting and also on our own armed forces. So the human security is now becoming completely meshed into our operational strategic and operational tactical planning. this prevention and protection, I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's either or. I think that you've got to do one to achieve the other. So I think we're going down a rabbit hole with that.
I think that actually reiterates the Senator's comments this morning about you don't have a state unless you've got the people. So, sorry, I paraphrased that, Senator, which was incorrect, but I think I kind of got what you meant. So what I want to do now is, first of all, thank you for having the discussion. It's not over yet. We are now going to open the floor to questions from our attendees. And then at the last little bit of time, I'm going to turn it back over to the panelists for any last final remarks or posing some better questions to ask about human security as we lean forward into the nature of unchanging war and the conference. So can I have some questions? Great. Senator, we'll take you first, and then sir up at the front.
It's actually a comment, and this is when I talk about what do we bring to the table. So, Claire, you and I were on my very last trip in uniform together to the Women, Peace and Security conference in Brussels. But I now sit on the NATO Parliamentary Association side for Canadian parliamentarians. And I have these observations for you, which will tie very nicely into your comments. We know that in a NATO construct, and particularly in a Canadian construct, it is the people, it is the government that sort of says how we're going to approach human security. So I sit on these, I'm on the steering committee. Not once has there ever been a connection to what's happening on the military side in NATO. And I've been to 2 different events so far, and it is like, Venus and Mars is what the conversations are. So I think a challenge from a Canadian perspective is I do believe we have something to bring to the table. I believe it with my heart, just listening to these fabulous people, these parliamentarians have these discussions. But I also think that there has to be outreach both ways to connect in Canada, the political and the military side. So at least as Canadians, that the area that we control, that we go in with a comprehensive view on what human security is in the context of state security. So that's an observation. And then my second question is we've been talking, this has been very useful to look at how do we now start to operationalize this, take it out of realm. Well, I'm just telling you, when you're punching in a void, it's very hard to concretize whatever it is you're trying to do. So what would you recommend that we do to try and get, we've had definitions, no definitions, where should we be going? I've already told you what I think we need to do to link the top, but what are your recommendations?
Thank you, Senator. Who would like to respond? Rachel?
I think that if you're a nation like Canada and you are pushing at NATO headquarters for the North Atlantic Council to have these policies, whenever you go to the table, you take somebody from the military and you make sure that the policy writing language is going to be relevant to the military as well, and is also agreeable to the different political delegations. But also, if you push it, you ought to be willing to push NATO to be more accountable. I think that the military, in a way, it's allowed to get away with marking its own homework. And I'm not just talking about the National Armed Forces, I'm talking about the NATO command structure. And if you can mark your own homework, you're never going to come forward and say, actually, we're not so good at this. So if somebody from a delegation could say, right, we want this policy, but we don't just want an action plan that allows you to tell us how great you are. We want an action plan that brings out all the things that you could be better at or you need to work at.
Having been in many operational policy committees, Canada is one of the nations that brings usually its military rep with it. But I think one of the problems is that we don't often have, the last time I was there where we had a joint military political committee was when Angelina Jolie came. And I wonder why there were so many people at the table. I think there needs to be more joint committees, right? They're not often, they don't often have OPCs where they have joint committees. And this is where you get both the military and the political perspective, that otherwise they're divided. And, you know, many policies, as you know, there is, I mean, I don't think people can understand the absolute division between the political and where there's just no connection. And therefore, the policies sit and they're not appreciated or implemented. So I think that there are plenty of things that can be done, and that kind of can lead on within, you know, both at headquarters for engagement, if needs be. But I think it's still going to be a struggle to do this.
Thanks, Claire. David?
I think you can have all the policy you want, but unless you have a good understanding of what is meant by the policy and how to operationalize it by the martial forces on the ground, the capabilities, then you're forever going to be frustrated in realizing those policies. So you actually need someone to sit down and actually write down, and that then becomes the basis for your mindset, your training, your exercises, and then the execution and operations, the planning and execution operations.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Yes, sir, at the front.
If I can turn this on. I can't. Philip Berry, old soldier. Mike, thank you. Clearly I'm not technologically adept enough. Philip Berry, old soldier. I can't help thinking that more use could be made of international humanitarian law. Rachel brought it up a couple of times, and David, in an anecdote, alluded to one of the imperatives, but it is filled with imperatives and with transitive verbs. It is prescriptive. It is largely written in the negative, but not entirely. And it was written in the aftermath of peer-on-peer conflict and intended. We've forgotten about that because we haven't had any for quite a long time now, since 1949 when they wrote it. But that's what it was written for. It was written for what's happening in Eastern Europe today. And it was written in the aftermath of a time when a lot of Germans and Japanese were hanged or shot or took poison. And inconveniently, of course, the Soviet Union was a victor, and consequently it didn't happen to them. But for them, it always was a weapon of war. Rape is a weapon of war. And for people who are prepared to do that, anyway, my point is that IHL has a very good framework. And you could just take Geneva 3 and do what staff officers are trained to do and write the therefore column beside it and draw actionable conclusions that could be turned into doctrine. And it seems to me that we wrote it in 1949 and we teach it to recruits, but we don't use it very much as a framework and a platform for all the things we've just been talking about.
Thank you, sir. Any comments about IHL?
I think you're a little bit optimistic about IHL and its guidance for us to protect other people. The lawyers that I deal with on a weekly basis are telling me that some of the language in the POC policy is pushing the boundaries of what nations would be prepared to do. I'm a bit skeptical. I'm always skeptical of lawyers, and I just imagine that if it was a soldier with a CNN or MSNBC camera on their shoulder, they wouldn't be saying, well, IHL didn't tell me that I had to go and help these women who were just being trafficked into Russia, into Belarus or wherever, whatever the scenario is. And I think that legal advisors they've got a luxury of being in a headquarters, and they're not really thinking about that individual on the ground that's got to deal with that situation in the here and now.
But you could easily translate it into a handbook.
Oh yeah, it is. Yeah.
And teach it to recruits. And
Oh.
and we have issued soldiers' cards, little laminated
Yeah.
pocket guides that say, if you see somebody being raped, do something about it. But the framework in that rather old document is there to give you the hints and the guidance you need to, we've said operationalize a number of times. operationalize it, to give it to Corporal Bloggins, who finds himself in a lot of this market?
With a lot of the, I mean, a lot of the human security policies in NATO, they are based on international human rights law. For example, the CRSV policy, which I wrote, is based on international human rights law. It doesn't, carbon copy, but it actually is. But I mean, some of the things, for example, taking the pieces of international human rights law, that makes sense, because we have to remember, while rape has been a construct of war as a weapon of war since time immemorial, it's only been since 2008 that we've taken notice of it and actually done something about it. So having international, human rights law, international law, doesn't mean that we are going to act on it. And we do say things. What we don't say is that soldiers should respond to conflict-related sexual violence in any way, but it should be a pathway to somebody else. And we have all of those tools. I just think we're still struggling to implement them fully, but we are guided and shaped by what we see in international human rights law.
Rachel?
Let's just imagine that there is an invasion into one of the Baltic states, and we see that the adversary is using very similar tactics to what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. So that means that we could imagine that men will be killed, kids will be taken into whatever country this adversary is from, and women and girls are going to be raped. We might have a NATO enhanced forward presence troop based in that area. But at the moment, people would say, well, actually, it's up to the host nation police to deal with this incident. But if we were in an extreme conflict, chances are the police will have gone, they'll be overrun, there'll be lots of things going on. So at the moment, there's a reliance on the UN can do this, the ICRC can do this, first responders can do this. And all I'm asking for is that we start to get it into our mindset that we could do it in extremis. That's my, I think that we sometimes forget, we think that we're just going to be doing this in Afghanistan or the Congo, but let's try and imagine what it would be like in a NATO country.
Thank you, Rachel. David, did you
No,
have...
I think it's already there. Excellent
Yeah.
question on IHL. It's already embedded in human security. Just as just war theory is embedded in that. It's a series of nesting dolls. But yeah, no. Rachel is correct that a lot of it is already there in the stability operations and task doctrine. Is the expectation that if there is no one else, the military is the only one else to act. And then when possible, hand it off to agencies that are more suitable for it. But if there is no one else, there is no one else, and it does come down to the military to act. And we'll go back to the soldier of the gate guard who reported the domestic abuse. He reported it because he knew it was wrong and expected someone to do something about it. I know it's an antidote, but you can take it for what it's worth. No.
Thanks, David, and thank you, sir, for the question. I've got 3 lineups here. I'll go to General Arrington, then our student at the front, and then Dr. Martel.
First of all, thank you very much for some great comments about how state and human security are and need to be intertwined. Dr. Meharg's comments right after David's opening remarks almost dare me to ask the question, how? So I'm from the Strategic Joint Staff, John Arrington. I'm here to help, but actually I'm here to ask you how to help me because it's my job to do this. So bear with me for a very short period of time so I can frame this up and riff off some of the comments that have just been said. At one end of the scale, if we could imagine that human security is a problem happening in Canada or in the United States or another NATO country with the fear, the fear of being free of fear. And in fact, it's happening with gangs and murders and things downtown. So that's one end of the spectrum. And would we intervene, or would we expect the United Nations to intervene? Is it a policing problem or is it a military problem? And where along that scale does it become national or international security? So then we look at the other end of the spectrum, and this has been the last 8 months of my life, dealing with what is going on right now in Haiti. And this week there's discussions of the United Nations General Assembly talking about it. about intervention in Haiti at this other end, and whether it's policing or a multinational force that goes in, how do we deal with this? So my overall point and comment and leading to the question is, where is that line between human and state security that the good senatrice brought up this morning? Policing or military or state and international. It's very gray in my viewpoint, so I'd love any viewpoints or comments from the panel. And where is that transition where it goes from state security to human security? Where is that overlap? Because yes, I agree in most cases a common definition is required, but you also need some flexibility. Otherwise, we're handcuffing those very soldiers that you're trying to put on the ground. Comments?
Thank you, General Arrington. Rachel, I'd like you to start.
Oh, man. The line between state and human security, I mean, this is something that academics have been talking about since the end of the Cold War. But part of me thinks that because I'm obsessed with that soldier on the ground, that soldier on the ground doesn't even need to think about, is this state security or is this human security? Because if it's a state security issue, then the UN will have given its Security Council resolution. If it's a NATO area you think you're talking about, then the NAC will have sat. And they've decided that this is a state security concern. But for that soldier that's deployed, she or he will be dealing with the humans in that state. And so we spend a lot of time on academic discussion, but maybe I'm being too simplistic. I don't think we need to worry about that. We just need to know that when the line's crossed and we are now thinking about, well, this is a human insecurity concern that we have to respond to, that we've got our J2, our 3 and our 5, 7 already thinking, they've already put it into the doctrine, they've not used toxic language such as women, peace and security. Maybe human security is becoming toxic, I don't know. They've just given examples of how at the tactical level we can secure, protect humans. So that's probably not what you wanted to hear, but I think that it's a really glamorous question that lots of people have been asking for years, but ultimately from a military perspective, once they're deployed and they're out on the ground, what's going on in the UN or the NAC doesn't really impact on how they behave, what their conduct of operations is.
I'm actually talking about the decision to deploy. The people on the ground they're human beings, they're going to do the right thing in support, and we're getting much, much better. I'm talking about when and where do we intervene and make that decision at the national, local, international level.
Sorry, do you mean so let's say that there's something going on in Canada. I know nothing bad ever happens in Canada, or maybe I'm wrong. Incidentally, when I was in Afghanistan, if I went out on a patrol or I was in a helicopter, I thought if I ever get captured, I'm going to try and do a Canadian accent, rip off my UK flag, because I just think no one dislikes Canadians. If it's happening in your nation, then and your first responders can't respond or there's too much for them to do, then surely that is the point where the military step up. Sometimes in the UK, I've seen the military being used at the same time as first responders. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, and I'm really sad that I got chosen to try and respond to it.
Well, Clare, David?
Yeah, be more clever.
So, yeah, that'd be hard. So, as you know, that the responsibility to protect is a state responsibility, and only if a state can't or is unwilling to, is the international force to go in. That being said, in Haiti, this is a difficult one. I was in Haiti. I was deployed right after the earthquake and then before pulling out of Haiti, when everybody who was an international force was condemned for the same cholera epidemic that they brought in. So the lack of trust for anybody going into Haiti right now is a very difficult one, never mind the situation. But this is where I, at the very beginning, talked about we need to reframe and change the way we talk about armed conflict, because it is no longer the same armed conflict of resolutions and decisions from 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. what makes up an armed conflict now is corruption and gangs and trafficking and the insecurity that happens on the ground. But I don't think we've matched that in terms of political response. And I do believe it deserves a political response to say that this needs an intervention because of, and I'm not advising we go into Haiti, I'm just saying it needs a political response in any situation. In Sudan, be it Sudan, which isn't necessarily an armed conflict as well. But it is up to our politicians to change the way they think so our military can react to this. And state versus human security, to me, this is a bit like the personal is the political. They are both the same for me. You can't have state security without human security, and human security is men and women equally deciding on the security of their nation. How do we intervene in that? No idea. Sorry.
Thank you, Claire. David?
Right. Just trying to work out a framework here, or a hierarchy. Well, as Claire mentioned, human security cannot exist without state security, but a state cannot be stable enough to create security domestically without human security. You've talked about a couple of things. When does the military intervene? Well, when a nation's or coalition's strategic objectives or strategic interests become paramount, that it justifies the risk and the expense and the commitment. Sometimes those interests are very practical. Sometimes they're ethical and moral. You talked about the alleviating human security or threats to human security domestically. A good model is probably the Oka crisis, in which the military was called in because the police had two issues. One, they were outgunned in many ways. They couldn't handle the threat, but as well, the police lacked the legitimacy to deal with it and end up with a peaceful resolution. And that took a lot of discipline. The senator mentioned the idea of using someone other than the military to address natural disasters. I've been an advocate of a civil defense force for a long time. If you recall, in the Cold War days, European nations all had civil defense forces. When we first deployed to Bosnia under the UN mandate in support of the UNHCR, a lot of European civil defense forces came with us and provided a lot of the humanitarian relief there. So it's an excellent model to take that cross off the military's back. And create a bespoke force for it. And there's lots of models out there that we can use, a mixture of regular and reserve components, et cetera. But yeah, no, there's an aspect of domestic, but again, it depends upon the operational environment and the strategic interests that are there. One thing that touches upon the earlier point in this, that when we rewrote NATO doctrine, domestic doctrines across the Allies in the early part of the 2000s, we broke down that false divide on the spectrum of conflict between war and operations other than war. And we realized that irrespective of the campaign in which you find yourself, you have a set group of tactical activities and actions. And a lot of them can be addressed towards issues related to human security, depending upon the objectives and the situation at the time. Unfortunately, NATO and our allies are going back to that divide now. You look at the British Army, they've created a body of doctrine called war fighting, and it stovepipes those things, and it forgets about the relevance of issues like human security in the conduct of operations, because it creates that false divide again. So that's just something to be aware of. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the question, sir. We'll turn to the question at the front, and then our final question will be from Dr. Martel after that, and then we'll wrap up.
Tristan Price, thank you. My question is basically in regards to, we've heard a lot of talk about what states and organizations like Canada and NATO can do themselves in implementing policies for state security and human security. But I wanted to ask if there was a conflict, obviously what a state can do to ensure human security can only apply to the areas that they control. And so when you go past to the other lines, whatever happens past that is sort of, unreachable. and is under the control of the enemy or the other state. And so I was wondering if there was any actions that can take place to ensure that human security is perhaps happening over on the other lines, and obviously when you go to war, you kind of break diplomatic relations. So, but when it comes to ensuring human security, is there perhaps room for diplomacy in that regard? And the second part is just short, but is this possible with when our enemies are non-state actors like terrorists, secessionists, militant groups, and criminal organizations?
Thanks for the question. And you've done a great job to animate kind of the second part of our panel theme, which is in war-torn areas. So you've given us a kind of a good running dynamic there to grab. Who would like to start? How about Claire? Claire, I'd like you to begin.
I'm actually going to leave the first part to colleagues who have military experience, Rachel. But the second part is, I'm going to say no, in terms of if you have non-state actors, you've got groups, you've got Al-Shabaab, you have Daesh, you have... I don't think human security is necessarily... No, I know human security is not necessarily an element of discussion, up for discussion. So, yeah, I'm going to leave it there because the answer to the first, I'm not sure.
I think you might be talking about responsibility to protect in that first issue, where you've got a border, something else. The international community is aware that something is bad is happening. Are you suggesting that maybe forces would go over into that, even though they've got their area of operations? Are you suggesting that maybe to try and protect civilians in that other place, we should follow and try to help them?
It's on the note of how, if we can't go to a region and that region is controlled by another force, are there any ways that we could sort of influence or affect that force through diplomacy or through
Yeah, definitely diplomacy, and I don't know if I'm not a strategic communications expert, but I talked earlier about cognitive warfare and cognitive superiority. So for sure, nations can use everything in the cyber, in media to try and get that cognitive support. But ultimately, I don't know if you remember Sierra Leone, it was all about presence, posture, and profile. And you can keep blasting away messages that tell these people that you're concerned about them, and they'd be better off if they were in a democratic country or whatever. But if you're the individual in that country that's being abused, then all the psyops and all the strategic communications messages in the world, I don't think are going to make much of a difference. So I'd say that you have to rely on diplomatic engagement.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just add that because I opted out early. It's always, the first line is always diplomacy. I mean, your first line ever is not to send in troops, but diplomacy. And, the deployment is your last line of effort. Diplomacy, sanctions, if you call them diplomacy, there are many ways that you would engage, and that is on sort of non-state actors, right? The same kind of thing if you can. And then your last line of defense would be offensive with a military. So, yeah, diplomacy is favored. We like diplomacy.
I don't really have anything to add to that, not being an expert in it, but certainly either directly strategic communication influence diplomacy and direct communication, either directly to the nation or through its allied nations. Dealing with Russia is often dealt through Turkey and India, for example, directly. But that's about it. R2P is a whole nother thing. Again, it depends upon the strategic gains to be made by the coalition.
Sorry. Just think about that question that you asked, and maybe go and look at Syria. There's an organisation, I think, called the Blue Helmets. White Helmets, sorry, I'm thinking of the UN, the White Helmets. So we've not really talked today about the importance of civil society, but my cosmopolitan military would be engaging with civil society at the strategic, operational and tactical level. It wouldn't just be an annual event where we get civil society in. Civil society would be part of that planning team, obviously looking at the restrictions on what was being discussed. But nations do help the White Helmets and other organisations. So there are ways of a nation supporting civil society who are trying to create human security within their country.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Stephanie.
And thank you for your insights. I'm really enjoying the discussions. Of course, as an academic, any discussion about precision and definitions is, you know, our bread and butter to some extent, but I'm really glad, especially for the kind of operational aspects of the discussion. I'm really enjoying it. My question has to do with the fact that part of the controversy around the human security concept, especially when coming from the perspective of governments, but also militaries outside of NATO and Canada and the so-called West. And this is a good kind of pile-on to the conversation about the responsibility to protect, is that there is concerns, which are, you know, understandable to some extent, that favoring a human security approach can be perceived as a Trojan horse, right? As a pretext for more Western intervention in domestic affairs. And obviously here I want to shift the conversation a little bit away from war-torn areas specifically, but just to address concerns that exist across the board in certain regions. It's very prevalent in the Indo-Pacific, particularly even with states that are not necessarily in situations of active conflict, that they will say, okay, it's all well and good that we're talking about human security or trying to push that framework, but this is not something we should be doing, and we should instead, yes, focus on non-traditional aspects of security, but not necessarily from a human security framework, because this can get dangerous and intrusive and interventionist and even imperialist very quickly. So how would you suggest, either, you know, from a broader kind of Canadian perspective or NATO perspective, but also from the perspective of the military, that the military, when it comes to engaging with relationships or joint initiatives or even sharing of experiences or training with militaries from these countries who have some concerns around that, how would you suggest that this can be part of the way that we engage on human security related things in these activities?
Thank you for the comments and the question. And also, just to let everybody know, we will run over by 5 minutes, so we'll end at 11:05, not 11, because we're at 11.
Blame me.
I'm blaming the director, yes. Okay. David, do you want to start the roll here? Thanks.
Excellent question. Yeah, it's always a tricky issue. The Canadian Counterinsurgency Manual the Canadian Counterinsurgency Manual references the fine line has to be walked in working in particular cultures and societies, the line between moral relativism and cultural colonialism. You say, well, it's right for us, it must be right for you. And that was one of the huge failings of Afghanistan, starting right from the governance model. Now, we could have employed everyone and dug everyone their own personal well in Afghanistan, but if the governance model is wrong, and by extension, our version of human security for them is wrong, apart from the basic needs, then the whole thing's going to fall apart. So yeah, it's a careful consideration. Again, it's just understanding that everyone will accept that certain things are wrong, and you cannot turn a blind eye to them, and other things are best left to that society to decide how they want to develop it. And realize it within the overall generally acceptable moral parameters of human security. Right? That's not an answer necessarily, but it's certainly considered.
Great question, and there's also another criticism that comes that has been I've heard within NATO, is that human security weakens the structure of traditional security and makes us all weaker people, because God forbid we protect people. You know, the idea that human security is a Western construct is something I've had to live with for 20-odd years, that ever since the introduction of women, peace and security and gender, I've been force-fed this idea that it's all Western. And now, it's not, because these are the values coming from India, coming from any of our partners internationally. Not only have they signed on to CEDAW and international human rights conventions writ large, So any argument can certainly be deflated, and I've got really good at deflating those arguments, that you have signed on to international conventions, of which these are. You have signed on to things that the Security Council has put in if you were sitting at the time. You are part of this international conversation. So we're not imposing anything, we're just bringing together pieces that you already have. And that usually sort of pushes down a little bit of that. It is an argument that will often and constantly come. But I think we have tools to, and I think we should be taught those tools to articulate, as our forces, to say, we're not imposing anything on you. We're just, we're living the experience that you've already signed on to in terms of your values and rights.
I'd say that if you look at the international level, UN Security Council resolutions, and in the UN Security Council itself, those 15 members are an array of countries. I mean, while I was at the UN, I think Saudi Arabia was leading on human rights for a month. So at that grand strategic level, there will be an array of nations who are not traditionally associated with human security, but if they are agreeing to a Security Council resolution, they've signed up to it. But the second thing, which I think is more provocative, and it links a bit to what Claire was saying, human security for who? The people that don't want change, the people in Afghanistan who didn't want change, are people that were benefiting from the status quo. And we can be bystanders and we can say, actually, we went into Afghanistan and we were totally wrong because we tried to introduce human rights. Maybe the way we tried to introduce human rights was wrong, but it wasn't wrong for us to try and introduce human rights. So whenever a country says, no, I don't want you to come in and help, yes, of course, we need to look at the country that's offering to come in and help, but we should also think, why would somebody not want to improve something? It would be better to have a conversation with their civil society.
Thank you for your question. And I'm actually going to end there. I'm not going to ask you for your final remarks because I think that was such an incredible way to finalize the panel discussion, Rachel, Claire, and David, on our last question from Dr. Martel. I want everybody to help me thank our panelists, and I hope that you extend the conversation into break time and throughout the conference, because the practitioners sitting beside me are exemplary practitioners who have such deep experience that we need to pick their minds further to figure this out. So thank you so much for being with us.